Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Hamd Sayyed and I'm going to deliver a lecture from the neuroanatomy module for the medical students of second year MBBS, CMH Institute of Medical Sciences, Multan. The topic that we're going to talk about today is cerebellum. We're going to discuss a few salient gross features of this structure in this narration. The rest of the material is provided to you in the Power presentation slides. You can look at the pictures from there for better understanding. So right now let's talk a little about the cerebellum. Now the cerebellum literally means small brain. It has been named so because its gross appearance is similar to the cerebral hemispheres beneath which it lies. The cerebellum, if we recall from our embryology classes, is derived from the metencephalon part of the hindbrain, that is the rhombencephalon. Now if we were to look at a sagittal section of the brain and the brainstem, then we would see that beneath the large expanded cerebral hemispheres is the midbrain, the pons anteriorly, and the medulla oblongata, and posteriorly is the fourth ventricle, and behind that is the cerebellum. So this here is the pons, if you're following my pointer, and the medulla oblongata anteriorly, and posteriorly we can see is the fourth ventricle, and behind that is this structure known as the cerebellum. When we talk about the functions of the cerebellum, we have to keep three things in mind. Number one, maintenance of muscle tone. Muscle tone means that the muscles of our body are always in a state of partial contraction. This is because of the cerebellum. Also, the other function is equilibrium, or we could say posture and balance. So this is another key function of the cerebellum, that it keeps our body in line with a sense of position and orientation in time and space, so we don't sway or fall to one side. And the third function, which is an advanced function, is coordination. The cerebellum is responsible for coordination of the voluntary movements. So although this organ has several functions, if we were to summarize those functions, and we would then be getting these three essential ones which are always to be kept in mind, that is muscle tone, equilibrium, and coordination. These are the essential functions of the cerebellum. Also, we need to know that the cerebellum is connected to the brainstem, namely the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata, by nerve tracts or bundles of nerve fibers known as the peduncles. There are three peduncles: superior, middle, and inferior. So the superior cerebellar peduncle is connecting the cerebellum to the midbrain. The middle one connects it to the pons, and the inferior one connects it to the medulla oblongata. These are bundles of nerve fibers or tracts. And then now let's come to the cerebellum itself, its organization, the organization of gray and white matter within the cerebellum. So first, when we look at the gross appearance, we can see the surface is thrown into numerous folds. So these folds, also called the folia, the folds, or you can see the folia of the cerebellum. Folium literally meaning leaf. These have the superficial gray matter. So in case of cerebellum, superficially is the gray matter, and that is known as the cerebellar cortex. And inside that is the white matter of the cerebellum. So white, this is in purple. If this were the white matter, we can see this is lying inside, internal to the gray matter. And then once again, lying deeply within the white matter are groups of neurons which are known as the intracerebellar nuclei. So from external to internal, the gray matter, and then the white matter, and then again the gray matter. This arrangement of the gray matter superficial to the white matter is opposite to the spinal cord, in which the white matter was present external to the gray matter. But this organization is similar to the organization of the neurons and the nerve fibers in the cerebral hemispheres, because over here as well we see that the gray matter is present externally, known as cerebral cortex, and the white matter is present internally. Now as we look at the cerebellum from an external point of view, we can see this here is the superior surface of the cerebellum, and from below is the inferior surface of the cerebellum. So if we were to look at the superior view of the cerebellum, then this is what we would see from above. Here is the midline portion. This portion is known as vermis, V for vermis. It's the midline portion of the cerebellum, and on either side are the two lateral cerebellar hemispheres. So there are two lateral cerebellar hemispheres. So you can see this is a little similar to the organization as we see in the cerebral hemispheres, that it has two expanded portions and a midline vermis. As we see from above, the superior view, we can divide the cerebellum into an anterior lobe and a posterior lobe. So the part which is present over here on the superior surface and anteriorly, this part is known as the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. This portion over here, this is the anterior lobe of the cerebellum. So between the anterior lobe of the cerebellum and then the part behind that, which is known as this part, which I will be, just for sake of understanding, coloring in pink, this is the posterior lobe that you see over here. Between these two, this subdividing line is known as the primary fissure. So on the superior surface, you can see anteriorly is the anterior lobe, and posterior to that is the posterior lobe. This is the part behind the primary fissure. This line over here, known as the horizontal fissure, is simply the part which is separating the superior surface of the cerebellum from the inferior surface. It has no clinical or functional significance otherwise. So now that we've seen the superior view, let's look at an inferior view of the cerebellum. So inferiorly, if we looked at the cerebellum, then this part over here, this is the continuation of the posterior lobe, and ahead of that is another lobe of the cerebellum, which I'm just going to draw for you. This over here is the remainder of the posterior lobe, and this region over here, which I'm pointing towards with the arrow, is known as the flocculonodular lobe. The middle part is the nodule, and on either side are the floccules. This is the flocculonodular lobe. Flocculonodular lobe, and this portion, which was the posterior lobe. So between the posterior lobe and this flocculonodular lobe is another fissure, a subdividing fissure. This is known as the uvulonodular fissure. Okay, so we see that the cerebellum has been divided into three lobes. So let's just recap these lobes. The anterior lobe, the part you see over here, this is the anterior lobe, which is visible on the superior surface, and then separated by the primary fissure. Behind that, this part is the posterior, also known as the middle lobe of the cerebellum. You can also see it from the inferior view. And then the last one, separated from the posterior lobe, by the uvulonodular fissure is the flocculonodular lobe. As you can see it inferiorly. These are the three lobes of the cerebellum: anterior, middle, and the flocculonodular lobe. So we can essentially imagine the cerebellum as a structure that is folded upon itself. And if we were to open or flatten out this folded structure, then in the anterior to posterior direction, we would see these three lobes: anterior, posterior, and flocculonodular. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw a flattened view of the cerebellum, imagining that it has been spread out. In that case, we can see that this is the anterior part, the hemispheres, and over here this is the flocculus, one on either side, and the nodule in the middle, and this here remaining part is the vermis in the midline. So this is a flattened view of the cerebellar cortex, and it's showing the main cerebellar lobes. In the midline is the vermis, on either side are the two cerebellar hemispheres, and this over here is the flocculonodular lobe. Now what is the functional organization? What are the functional areas of the cerebellar cortex? So we just have to keep in mind, just as we talked about the cerebral hemispheres and we talked about the cortical homunculus, which is a miniature human being, a similar homunculus is also present on the cerebellum. And in this case, if we follow the functional representations of the body parts on the cerebellar cortex, we have to keep in mind that this area in the midline, which is known as the vermis, is the part that influences the movements of the long axis of the body, this part, the vermis. And by that we mean the movements of the neck, the shoulders, the thorax, abdomen, and the hips. Now immediately lateral to the vermis is then this area, immediately lateral to the vermis. These are the parts on either side which are going to represent the so-called intermediate zone of cerebellar hemispheres, and they control the muscles of the distal parts of the limbs, especially those of the hands and feet. And then when we come to the lateralmost zone, over here, the lateralmost zone on either side of the cerebral hemispheres, this is the part which is concerned with planning of movements, and dealing with any consequential errors and sorting out those errors. So the functions are advanced from the middle towards the lateral side. And if we were to make a homunculus which showed the somatosensory projection areas in the cerebellar cortex, and as we saw when we talk about the midline, which represents the vermis, which represents the mid-axis of the body, then this would be the trunk, the abdomen, the thorax, and the head and neck, the face, and the eyes of our miniature human being in the midline. And then this zone, which is the lateral zone, immediately lateral to the vermis, is the part where the distal limbs, the hands and feet, their movements are controlled. So this would be the area where we would be having the representation of the hands and the feet. And this is how we have a miniature human being representing the corresponding areas on the cerebellar cortex. Now I also talked about the intracerebellar nuclei. Now coming to the nuclei within the cerebellum. So if we take a section through the cerebellum and we looked at the position of those nuclei, then let's just look at half of the cerebellar cortex, which is thrown into the folia. Then we would see that beneath that is, beneath the gray matter, the superficial gray matter, is the white matter. And then within that white matter are again the neurons, the groups of nuclei. So from the lateral to the medial side, these are, the largest one is like a crumpled bag opened medially. This largest nucleus, which is the collection of neurons, within this portion, which is the white matter, see this is the white matter, and within the white matter further are the collection of neurons. this first collection of neurons is known as the dentate nucleus. D-E-N-T-A-T-E. This is known as the dentate nucleus. Okay, and then medial to the dentate nucleus there is the emboliform nucleus, and then medial to that one or two groups of nuclei called the globose nucleus, and medial most is the vestigial nucleus, which is the closest to the midline. If this is one cerebellar hemisphere, then we can see in the direction lateral to medial is the dentate, and then the emboliform. Just going to write the first letter of that, the first letter, and then the the globose nucleus, and most medially is vestigial. So if we wanted to make a mnemonic, we could say D E F G M. D E G and then F. Dentate, emboliform, globose, and vestigial. So these are the four intracerebellar nuclei which are embedded within the white matter of each cerebellar hemisphere from the lateral to medial direction. And it is the vestigial nucleus, the fibers of which leave through the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So the fibers of vestigial nucleus leave the cerebellum through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, whereas the remaining three, globose, emboliform, and dentate, their fibers leave the cerebellum through the superior cerebellar peduncle. Okay, so now that we're done with this, I'm going to discuss the remaining topics of the cerebellum in my PowerPoint slides, which I've also provided to you. So why don't we go back to those slides, and I hope this has been helpful for you. Thank you.